All right, the clock has started. It's kind of intimidating, actually. It's great to see everybody. We are so excited to talk about how all of these folks in the panel and just organizations across Indiana have worked together to support kids and families over the last 2 years. I am Brandon Brown. I'm the CEO of the Mind Trust. We are an Indianapolis-based education nonprofit that was originally founded in 2006 with the mission for all students in Indianapolis to have access to a high-quality school. Since 2006, we've raised about $160 million to support children across the city. We've launched, I think, 46 new schools during that time, have launched 12 new nonprofit organizations, and have worked to recruit several national groups to Indianapolis. And I have the distinct privilege with working with these incredible leaders on the stage who are going to introduce themselves when they answer the first question, because we know that we're under some strict constraints with timing. So that's enough from me, and I'm going to kick it off just with a question. So think back to March of 2020, the early days of the pandemic. Mid-March, schools literally shut down overnight, and the entire system had to transform itself pretty much over a weekend. So would love to hear from each of you, what were the early moves and strategies and creative partnerships that you established when COVID hit and you knew that, you know, what we thought of as normal no longer existed? Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for choosing our session to spend some time with us today. So my name is Alicia Johnson. I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the superintendent of Indianapolis Public Schools. We were talking earlier, it's kind of crazy to think back to that time. I think I've blacked out some portions of the time because of the trauma of it all. But I was really proud of the way in which we just really thought about how do we respond to the most immediate needs of our students and families. I'll highlight 3 things that we really focused on. One was a partnership with Gleaners Food Bank, which is a local nonprofit in terms of getting food to our families, and that looked like our bus drivers literally loading up school buses and providing those food items to our families as needed, and that was open to our whole community. The second thing is we were not a one-to-one district as it relates to computers and devices prior to the pandemic, and so we literally turned to logistics companies, sort of collected back all of the computers that were out into the space, and then redistributed those to our high school students so that they could continue on their path to attain the credits they needed for graduation. It was a massive undertaking, and we were able to pull that off. And the third thing I'll highlight is a partnership with Circle City Broadcasting, which is a local news company, and we were able to televise lessons based on our students' curriculum to our K through 8 students. And so again, just trying to, as many ways possible, leverage the partnerships we had available to us in our community to ensure we were meeting the needs of our students and families.
Hi, everyone. I'm Patrick McAlister. I'm the director of the City of Indianapolis Office of Education Innovation. OEI is a charter school authorizer. We have 18,000 students in 45 schools in our portfolio. During the pandemic, though, one of my main roles was to be the chair of the Indianapolis e-learning fund. This was a fund established by the corporate and philanthropic community within weeks of the emergency declaration being made. We raised about $4.5 million, most of that coming within 48 hours of the fund being established. And we had a couple of main things that we did pretty quickly. One was because of how tight supply chains were and the need for funds to flow, we, within a month, were able to get money out the door to schools so that they can begin purchasing hotspots and laptops to begin to address the major gaps we had in technology and internet access for students. The other thing that we were able to do shortly thereafter was establish the Indiana e-learning lab, which became the Indiana Learning Lab, which was a $1.2 million initial investment from the local corporate and philanthropic community. There were other subsequent investments that happened over time, but the online platform that was created provided teachers, students, and families high quality, rigorous curricular access and e-learning supports early in the pandemic to, in addition to trying to address these sort of hotspot and device needs that we had to address the sort of new learning landscape that we had entered into shortly thereafter. And like you, Dr. Johnson, I've blocked out most of those first few months.
So good afternoon. I'm Katie Jenner, Indiana Secretary of Education. And I just want to pause a moment because I feel like I know half this room. Who in here is from Indiana? Raise your hand.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know who's watching at home, but you should know that probably 60 to 70% of folks raise their hand. And if you're not from Indiana, we love you too. And we welcome you to our state anytime and always. But I wanted to point that out because this is all about partnerships. And every single, and you know, you all, folks in here know I tend to point people out and call people out. There's not any partnership that would not be possible without you, your leadership. We have people here from Indiana who are superintendents, who brought their workforce person, who brought their economic development person, who brought business leaders. So in Indiana, our momentum is incredible, and we are laser focused on blurring the lines between early learning, K-12, higher education, workforce to make the greatest impact for our kids. And again, we have communities all over the state right here who are learning more and being pushed by America's thought leaders because we're getting after it. In terms of COVID, I'd like to not only, we heard the reflection of the partnership with our health officials and the partnership with philanthropies and launching the Indiana Learning Lab, but I'd like to just really hit on as COVID hit, it had some significant impact on learning, of which we have a choice to make as a state, as a country. We have a choice to make about how bold we're willing to be. We have a choice to make about how fast we're willing to move and about how intentional we're willing to be. You can't boil the ocean. You know that doesn't work. I keep trying. It doesn't work, I guess. But you can't boil the ocean. We have to be focused in. And so the main things I'd hit on, literacy and STEM, student pathways that lead to intentional enrollment, employment, enlistment leading to service, launching the Indiana GPS, this is a little plug. That session is next. I'm not on it, but I will be attending. The Indiana GPS is re-envisioning how we are quantifying, if you will, the education to workforce continuum. We know students are so much more than just a single test score, and it's a whole data system, a whole data story. So that's being built in Indiana. And then the fourth area I'd mention just very quickly that was all spurred through COVID is we have an educator pipeline challenge as a country. And so in Indiana, one thing we saw is our data is way too lag. We must have lead data in order to best triage and make informed decisions. And so we have launched an educator supply-demand marketplace. If you imagine the supply from our teacher prep programs, from our training programs, you imagine the demand, what do our schools need right now? And then how is the supply feeding the demand, or is it not? Do we have, 6 students sitting at Purdue University right now, and I love Purdue.
Go Boilers.
But six students sitting at Purdue University right now who maybe are studying to be biology teachers, and maybe 4 of them get recruited to a biotech company before they even make it into our classroom. I think as a country, we assume a lot and don't often know exactly what's happening in our educator pipeline. So those are 4 things, high level.
Love it. So we'll stick with Secretary Jenner. There were a couple state level initiatives that the legislature worked on. So one was a $150 million learning recovery fund that the State House passed, a couple months into the pandemic. And it has really allowed, I think, break the mold, cross-sector partnerships across the state. And then recently, this legislative session, a $25 million microgrant program, to provide resources directly to kids and families to, use those resources in order to accelerate learning. So would love to hear from your perspective, Secretary Jenner, around, kind of those 2 initiatives and the role that the state has played trying to spur local partnerships across the state.
So the Student Learning Recovery Grant, and I have to give kudos where it's due. Our General Assembly in late April of last year devoted about $150 million to build out and leverage community partners, which could include our education service centers. It could include the Girls and Boys Club. It could include any number, could include the Mind Trust, United Way, the mayor's office, right? Any number of community partners to essentially triple down for kids, to work together, not schools alone, but work together as community partners. So we'll give them our all while they're at school, what's happening after school, what's happening before school, what's happening at summertime. We need everyone involved in making sure we're doing everything we can to not only recover from COVID, but it's much bigger than that. And you know this in the room. It's accelerate. It's find the opportunities. So we partnered as a state with the National Center for Assessment and said, hey, peel back exactly where we are as a state. Where are we locally and in different regions in terms of the impact that we've seen? Where are our various student populations? And what we found is we have moderate to significant impact in every region across our entire state. And again, in order to best get after it the quickest, let's leverage all the people to focus on 3 areas: literacy, math, college career readiness. And let's work with our communities to build out partnerships that might work best for them. And then we as a state, of course, we have an outcome management system, a data system where we're watching all of the outcomes. And I'd like for Brandon, I'm going to pass it back. I love asking others questions. Y'all know this. Brandon Brown has an amazing example I want him to share from the Mind Trust perspective. And we could, again, I could hit St. Joseph County. I could hit multiple different areas of our state, but I think that's important for him to hear. The one that is brand new, hot off the press in Indiana, and this is going to kind of be it's probably a next year presentation, I bet. But we had quite a few of our families and parents say, hey, we'd like to do more for our child in the area of literacy and math, and we know our school's doing everything they can for them, but number one, what can I do to help my child, and how do I pay for that? So we are using some of our Esser dollars, our discretionary dollars, to launch enrichment grants for parents. And we'll partner directly with our schools to do that. But, basically, some of our most vulnerable and at-risk parents could leverage an enrichment grant and then pay for that tutoring service that might be down the road that they'd really always love to do for their child. So we're in the process of building that out, but that is more to come on that. And yeah. Brandon, share a good example of this.
Sure. So, what was clear actually 2 summers ago when schools and school districts were having conversations about whether or not to reopen, it was clear that working families, right, had massive burdens and had a choice to make. Do you quit your job to, work with your kid at home, or do you do something else? And it was clear that marginalized families in particular, it wasn't fair for leaders in the community just to, make that choice for them and, assume that they're going to fend for themselves. So we were able to work with 40 nonprofit organizations across the community to create community learning sites, which were open during the day while school was closed, raised a lot of local philanthropy to make this possible. And then we got about halfway into the school year and we started getting questions about, well, what's going to happen during the summer? So we were able to work with United Way Central Indiana to launch a community-based summer learning program that was in schools and nonprofit organizations. So we're talking about churches, we're talking about neighborhood institutions that have mass amounts of trust in the community. launched it, over the span of a couple months, and it was only made possible because of the state level funds that were able to come in, supplement our philanthropy, and really scale it up. So served around 3,000 kids last year, saw significant results academically. We're able to get that grant renewed and extended, and we'll be serving hopefully almost twice as many kids next summer in this, kind of community-based approach, working with school districts, working with charter schools, working with churches, working with nonprofit organizations. And the lesson that we learn from this is that too often in K-12 education, we think about school as a building. And the reality is that there are community assets across our communities that from 8 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. are being underutilized. And those are the organizations that have so much trust, so many, massive amounts of, track records for our families. And we're thinking a lot about how do we not think about school as a school building, and how do we, really start to leverage the assets that we have across the board. So, I think that's a good example because it was a local community coming together with philanthropy, right? And then working with the state to really scale it up to serve as many kids as possible.
And then, of course, we're watching all outcomes. I mean, the reality is anytime you take a risk, you have to acknowledge some of it's going to work, some of it we're going to have to learn from and make it better the next time. So we're watching outcomes across the state with no judgment other than to learn and keep improving. One thing that I'll hit on that you did well, that I think we all could learn on, and I think we are for this coming summer, is the value of the pre and post assessment. Understanding where a child starts, not just end of the year assessment, but right when they start that program and right when they end that program. And again, their results are exceptional.
Thanks. All right, Superintendent Johnson, you've done a lot to work with a variety of stakeholders locally, both in the philanthropic community, the district's own foundation, and I think that you've leveraged a lot of federal money in truly creative ways. So would love for you to talk a little bit about that work.
Sure, thanks. Obviously, we're a large district, largest in the state, and so we receive lots of funding from the federal resources available. So it was really important for us to do a couple things. One, to be transparent about the use of those dollars, and two, to hear from our community. What is it that we're doing well that we should be doing more of to leverage the funds, and then what is it that we're not doing so well that you love to see us do more of, and how do we use this unique moment in time to really build? And so we launched a number of community conversations that we held last year to get that direct input from our community across a number of schools across the district to hear that feedback. And then the team actually built an Esser funding tracker. So if you go to our website, about 3 clicks, you can get to a tracker that demonstrates how much we've spent and then what projects we're spending those dollars on. We also give a monthly update to our board about what we're doing. So literally every single month, you can see the presentation of these are the dollars that we've encumbered, that we've already spent, and here's what those dollars are getting used for. So trying to be super clear and transparent about how we are leveraging, the sort of once in a lifetime resources that we've received as a district to do 2 things that we've really named right now. One, to keep our schools safe and open. We thought this year that was going to be a breeze. It has not been a total breeze to do that. We all experienced January and what that brought us and trying to keep our schools open and safe. And the second thing is to accelerate learning for recovery, but also for redesigning the future. So how do we think about pilots and small scale efforts we're trying now and using those things to leverage for perhaps bigger bets in the future, and be smart about thinking about both the near term need and the longer term goals that we're trying to reach in terms of better student outcomes. So our Education Equity Fund with our Indianapolis Education Foundation has been great. At the beginning of the pandemic, the question was, how can we help? We needed to be able to give folks a clear answer to that, and so having the Ed Equity Fund was a great way to do that. Our foundation has been able to give a number of mini grants to schools based on the projects they're trying to do at the school level to fund those things through the Ed Equity Fund. And then I've talked a lot about our Esser work that we've been doing there and will continue to do until that sunsets in 2024. So those are a couple of ways in which we thought about philanthropic resources and then really trying to use our federal dollars both to respond to the now, but also to use as a jumping off point for the future.
That's great. So question for Patrick. So for those of you who don't know, the mayor of Indianapolis is the only mayor in the country that directly authorizes charter schools, which is, clearly nationally unique, and it gives the mayor's office, I think, a really interesting direct view, relative to our K-12 education system. And you were specifically instrumental in working to launch a new initiative, again, in close collaboration with both IPS and the state, to connect children and families to local services, knowing that, yes, there's been massive amounts of learning loss, right? But a lot of trauma, across the board. And schools aren't going to be able to operate completely in a silo. So would love for you to talk a little bit about what that initiative is.
So I think what's true is that none of this is possible unless we all work together. And so the City Connects initiative, which the city of Indianapolis is investing in, also includes investments from IPS in some of their elementary schools, and also includes funds from the 1008 grants that Dr. Jenner was talking about earlier. I'm interested in trying to figure out how we can better understand what students want and what they need outside of their academic needs that we kind of see going up. And I think it's important to note that prior to the pandemic, many of these issues of need and want existed in many of the communities that our schools serve. And so the city was allocated $419 million as a part of the American Rescue Plan Fund, and we're investing $7.5 million over 3 years in City Connects. City Connects is a program out of Boston College. It's been around for a decade and a half. If you look at any measure, it has a significant impact on student outcomes. And basically what happens is at the school level, a coordinator works with students and teachers to identify the needs and wants of students. And every student is involved in this survey. So it's an efficient program because you can do this at a 400-to-1 student-to-coordinator ratio. And what happens then is the coordinator identifies the needs and wants of students, and then they connect those students and families with resources that the community may provide, or identifies gaps that the community may need some additional investment in to create. And this can kind of take a lot of different directions. It's really interesting. So City Connects has been working in Ireland, and one of the things that was identified in a student survey was that many students didn't know how to swim, and they wanted to learn how to swim. So the community came together, invested in upgrading their community pool resources, invested in swim coaches and teachers, and students were then able to learn how to swim from this. There was also an interest in Lego design and construction, and so they created a bunch of sites where students could go and build really complicated and interesting things with Lego. And so what I'm interested in is the program provision. I think it's really important for schools to be a place where students can connect with resources and their families can be connected to resources that exist in the community. But I'm also interested in the supply side of this. If we know what students want and need, how will that reshape our public investments, our philanthropic investments, and what can we do with that data from a public standpoint to shift the conversation towards what students actually say they want and need, and away from what adults say they think students want and need, which I think is unfortunately very common in the student provision standpoint. So we're investing in the program. We're also investing in using the data from City Connects to display for the community those wants and needs, and hopefully I can come back later and update you on what that looks like.
That's awesome. All right, so we'll stick with you two. So in Indianapolis, we have a really robust school choice landscape. We've got one of the largest private school voucher programs in the entire country, a very large charter sector, and we have 11 school districts inside of one city. And that's a whole different session around how that came to be. One of the challenges, quite frankly, of the last 2 years is how do you manage such a decentralized education system during a global pandemic? So would love to hear from these two leaders about, specifically how did the charter school district partnership work, or frankly not work? And how did those two systems try as hard as they could to work together?
Yeah, I'll start. I mean, I think if I think back to the beginning, and actually some things that have continued even now, one of the most important things was communication and information sharing. Like, none of us knew what in the world is happening. How are we going to navigate this point in time? So our principals who worked within our district, as well as our charter partners, that was the question. Like, what is everyone doing? Are we sort of aligned with what folks are doing? What information do we have available to us to make the best, most informed decisions? So from the very beginning, we were convening weekly leaders who were affiliated with the district, and to say, okay, here's what we know. We were having conversations with our Marion County Health Department director regularly, sometimes 10, 11 o'clock at night, what's going on.
She calls all the time.
Yeah, here's the situation. Many, many late night calls with her, but just making sure we were sharing information. That's something we've actually kept in place even since 2020, is that cadence of regular calls to say, here's what we know. Here's what's on the horizon. Here are the decisions we have upcoming to make, so we can ensure just common information sharing. I think when you think about, and Patrick will probably talk about this a little bit as well, when it came time to those operational decisions, there were decisions that sometimes were made that were the same across the sectors, and then sometimes were different depending on sort of the priorities and the local context that those schools had. But to me, I think there was a lot of power in that common information sharing and understanding of just sort of how are we navigating this moment in time.
I think information access was really key to this, and I see some of the school leaders of charter schools that we authorize, and I'm sure you remember the crazy Zoom calls we had of every charter leader and the health department director trying to understand what was going on, ask questions so that things can get clarified, and hopefully align on some commonalities. And so I tried to serve as a facilitator to some extent for that. And help schools kind of make the best decision they possibly can make for their local context. Sometimes it involved, the district having to make a call, especially if a school, we have a lot of complicated partnerships that are great, but some of our charter schools do leverage district transportation. So if the district had to make a decision about whether or not a school would be open, whether or not the district would be open, then the school would have to align with the district's transportation schedule. But other times, schools could make a decision about whether or not their community was open. They could survey their students, talk to parents, and make an independent call if they wanted to. So it was really messy. It was really complicated, but I think we were able to elevate the voices of charter leaders so that they at least had access to information. And when there was a decision matrix where they could make a decision, they were given the space to do that based on what they're hearing from their students and families.
And it seems to me like if there weren't established relationships, that spanned years and years before, it would have been like a much larger mess, right? Because of how much autonomy school leaders have, and I do think that given the circumstances, it was really heartening to see what that cross-sector collaboration looked like, and I think in large part that was because relationships had existed beforehand, which is really rare. All right, Secretary Jenner.
Yes.
For those of you who don't know, she is the first Secretary of Education in our state's history. It's pretty awesome. So at the beginning of COVID, she was the senior education advisor for the governor. And then under a year and a half ago, she became our first Secretary of Education. So would love to hear from you, knowing that you're a very urgent person who is never satisfied with status quo, which is why you're great. What do you see as the future vision for education in Indiana? And coming out of the pandemic, what's the new normal that you hope to create for the state?
So coming in January of 2021, one of the things, and again, it's a large Indiana contingency in here, other than a few special people. Great to see you, Christina. One of the things our governor said is we've spent many, many years as a state going back and forth between the DOE or the State Board of Ed, and we have some State Board of Ed members in here as well, or the House or the Senate or the charter versus public versus, a lot of back and forth for a long time. But if we know truly that we can make the greatest impact when we work together and we remove barriers and just get after it, then what does that look like for Indiana? So we did a lot of listening, and we set forth on a mission to create a very simple to understand focus, which is student-centered and future focused. So where are we today and where are we going? So we devised a shared vision, which 3 pillars of focus: student learning and opportunity, which includes greater access to early learning. It includes, as I mentioned, the foundational skills have to be strong: reading, access to STEM, pathways. The second pillar, educator talent, quality, and value. And I mentioned again our supply-demand marketplace, doing everything we can to celebrate educators and elevate the profession despite the uncontrollables we'll always face. And then thirdly, system alignment and capacity. System alignment and capacity means at the state level and at the local level. At the state level, we needed to get out of our own way, and the Department of Ed must work with the Commission for Higher Education, the Department of Workforce Development, our Economic Development Secretary at Indiana. We all have to work together if we're really going to make the most change. And then that extends down to, and I think almost more important, locally, the state getting out of the way so that locals can drive change that is meaningful for kids. I could highlight a number of our strategies and tactics, of which is available to all of you for your reading enjoyment tonight, maybe on the plane home. How about that? But one such partnership I do want to just acknowledge really, really quickly. Again, when we think about this session here, we launched something called Crossing the Finish Line. So in Indiana, here's what's fascinating. So when you look at NAEP scores, Indiana's typically in the top 15 in reading and math, or ELA and math, I should say, in most of our grade levels. But when you look at our educational attainment as a state, depending on the economist you speak to, we're probably 35th or 40th, again, depending on who you speak with. So we asked Ivy Tech Community College and Vincennes University, both are community college systems in the state, run the numbers on how close our students are in Indiana to completing a high quality credential. So we saw a major challenge. Let's look at the data and let's get after it. They ran the numbers, and we had last summer almost 2,000 students who were that close, within 2 or 3 credits of completing a credential. We had over 700 students earn the credential the summer after their senior year. It's a big access opportunity. But here's what's wild. We said it was very successful, so we ran it again. And this is a partnership with DOE, CHE, GWC, all the acronyms, plus almost every high school in the state of Indiana who had students attending, and Ivy Tech Vincennes. This year, they ran the numbers. From one institution alone, we have almost 17,000 students sitting in our Indiana classrooms. That's about 20%, over 20% of a cohort, a graduating cohort, sitting in our classrooms this close to earning a high-value credential. So using partnership, the power of partnership. I'm a hand talker, and I feel like I've almost knocked you out multiple times,
all right.
Patrick.
The Will Smith slap?
Yeah.
Is that no?
No, gosh. But I am a hand talker. But leveraging our partners, and this is state, this is local, leveraging this is higher ed, this is K-12, this is workforce, to just look at our data and then get after what we need to. And one of those things is educational attainment. That's called Crossing the Finish Line. But that's another thing that came that's one of several initiatives that's all partnership driven that came out of the momentum we're seeing post-COVID. Or during COVID, whatever we are right now.
In the shift to an appointed Secretary of Education, which was, I think, relatively controversial at the time, but what it does logistically is it aligns the state government around one vision, and now that vision's going to depend on who the governor is, right? But the coherence that we're seeing from the state, the last, I would say, 12 to 16 months, is light years ahead of where we've been for the last decade. And that's because there is coherence and there is one vision that's being implemented across state government. So, I think it's more and more clear what the vision is, and it's clear, who the partners are to go achieve that vision relative to what's been true for a long time. So that was, I think, a really important policy shift in our state that not everybody liked, that has created more clarity relative to the state's vision. All right, so we got 5 minutes left. As we wrap up, would love to do just, maybe 1 or 2 minutes each around any words of advice or any lessons learned from the last 2 years that you would like to leave the audience with. And we'll start with Superintendent Johnson.
Katie already told me I had to start. Dr. Jenner said I had to start. So I think there are a couple things when Brandon sort of brought this question that I thought about. One is the sort of proof of nimbleness that is possible. I think particularly leading a school system is often sort of like, oh, it's big and it takes forever to do things. It's so bureaucratic. And not that those things aren't still true in many ways, but also I think the last 2 years demonstrated, particularly at least to me in our system and probably a number of superintendents, that like we can be quite nimble, quite urgent about our work, and when we need to respond to something, we can do so. So it should not continue to take, a crisis at the proportion of a pandemic to continue to have us working with that same level of urgency and nimbleness about what is possible. And I think being able to sort of have that sort of proof point has been really powerful over the last 2 years to talk to my team about, and why we can continue to move with urgency and intentionality around better outcomes for our students. I think the other thing that I think a lot about is we can't do this alone. I think this panel is an example of the ways in which partnership is so powerful. Dr. Jenner has given many examples of how that's playing out across our state. But that is the reality situation. We know, particularly for our families who are most vulnerable, they are experiencing many, many systems, oftentimes that are not talking to one another, that are not coherent, that are not aligned, and then we're expecting them, again, in the most vulnerable situations, to have to navigate all of those systems. And so we have to continue to push ourselves as we are thinking about our own sector and systems and schools and what we're doing. How does that intersect with the industry sectors around us that our families are having to navigate, again, our most vulnerable, sometimes on a daily basis, and how can we be more coherent on their behalf? And so I think those are the two things that I think a lot about right now as we think about what, again, recovery, but then also rebuilding for a stronger future looks like for our students and families.
So I think we've talked a lot about what partnership looks like. I want to note that we disagree a lot. And it's,
Who does?
Right. There's a lot of disagreement.
I've disagreed with like every person in this room, so you're all no.
That's right.
I don't know a couple of y'all, so tomorrow.
So there is disagreement, but I think what's unique about Indiana is we continue to talk even after disagreement to see if there's alignment that we can reach. And I think the way that we work together across the state, the local district charter, even with the private schools as a part of the conversation as well, because they are a key constituency and element of education in Indianapolis. We can find places to align, and that's great, but we can also disagree, but we do it in a way that retains the relationship so that we can continue to work together as we go forward. I think one more quick thing that I'll note is that as we emerge from this pandemic, we have to really think about how we make sure students have the resources that they need, the non-academic resources that they need to be successful. I don't think we're going to recover academically if we don't think about that piece of the puzzle. I think City Connects could be a possible way to do that, and would love to come back and talk to you about that in the future. But we, as a collectively, have to figure out what that looks like, and I think there are a lot of interesting things that the district is doing, that the state's doing, that helps directly address those non-academic needs for students.
It's interesting that Patrick mentioned that disagreement element, and I mean this lovingly, but if you don't have somebody around you who is challenging you to think harder, to push further, to be better, then you better find that person. I'll give you myself one after this. I'm glad to be that one for you. But we have to have those people who are just driving us to be better for kids. Every single one of you in here, because you're here, is absolutely a thought leader in your community, in your state, and beyond. I think as thought leaders and educational leaders, one thing that we're going to have to do more of is it's not just give people permission to go, but we're going to have to empower our people to go, to do it, to try it. And just up front, acknowledge, again, it might not be perfect. And I look at some of the superintendents in the room here. One of you talked to me last night, this morning, I don't know when it was, sometime, the past 24 hours. And you said, sometimes as superintendent, we're not able to, actually, this might have been a not-for-profit person, but as superintendent, we have a board, we have a community. If we push too much too fast, it might mean that we're not there the next day. But how do we get to a point where we surround ourselves and build a culture in our community of that which is, we got to try everything possible for kids and we don't have time to waste. And that's on us as people to just empower and push. The second thing is flexibility. If there are barriers in your way, get it out of the way. Get it out of the way. If you can't get it out of the way, you should make a call to someone who can. Those barriers causing us to go too slow are unacceptable, and we can't tolerate them any longer. And guess what we learned during COVID? There were tons of barriers every single day, and they moved out of the way because they had to. So flexibility is key, and we have to keep that expectation. Third thing, final thing, because we're at our 40, Gemini. Goes so fast. Third thing, final thing, data modernization. Data modernization. I was in a session this morning about durable skills, and they talked about how LMS systems are built to be course-driven, but yet we're trying to get to a place where it's more competency-driven, where we're trying to drive skills and knowledge. We're going to have to modernize our data systems. And some of you vendors in the room, or you philanthropists, venture capitalists, help us to push this faster. I think that's going to be so key for our country. And Indiana is ready to lead the way as a parent by all the folks here. So, Brandon?
Hey, on that note, I just want to thank our panelists and all of you, especially the Hoosiers in the room. We'll stick around if there's any questions. Have a great day.